We just got a new ban list, and with that, I think the format changes a little bit from when I posted my last tier list. I'm gonna put up a quick screenshot of what I think an updated tier list would be. If you want to hear the explanations for the vast majority of decks you see on here, then be sure to check out the tier list that I uploaded last week. It happened to be before the ban list. I expected it to come out in January, and so I decided to make a best decks tier list. But overall, just a few decks have shifted around and most decks have stayed in the same place. But anyways, in this video, I'm going to be talking about which hand traps I think are going to be the best in this upcoming format. I personally feel like hand traps are going to be the norm in this format and the way to go, so I feel like it's more important than ever to know which ones are the best. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Starting off with Ash Blossom Joy Spring, I think this is definitely a main deck staple of this format. This card is just super versatile, hits cards like the Mulcharmies, which is good, and it also, of course, hits some key cards in strategies like ryzeal, like Duo Drive. And Ash against ryzeal in particular is pretty good because, at least from what I've seen, the ryzeal players who do try to protect Duo Drive usually protect it with the Photon XYZ, which prevents targeting and destruction. So it would prevent cards like Imperm and Ogre, but it wouldn't prevent cards like Ash. But even outside of that, Ash is just the most versatile, and going into a new format, I feel like it's just a safe bet to play in your main deck, and there's really no reason not to play it in my opinion. Next up is Cherries, and I think that Cherries actually has some side deck potential this format. I personally think that ryzeal will be the best deck, and of course if you Cherries the Detonator, then the deck just doesn't really do that much. But outside of that, I'm not really too sure if there are that many great Cherries targets that are like standout hits. You could potentially side it against all the Fiendsmith decks with hitting a card like Sequence, for example, and that could be pretty good into a lot of them because I think Fiendsmith decks are still going to be pretty popular, so there is some potential there. But once again, it's not something that every deck is going to be able to play because you need quite a bit of space in your extra deck to get full value out of it, and so for that reason, I think it's a safe side deck potential. If your deck can support the extra deck cost, I actually don't think it's too bad and can definitely catch a lot of people off guard. Next up is Droll and Lockbird, and I think that Droll and Lockbird is pretty good against the ryzeal deck. Most of their starters will always start off by searching a card, and that'll prevent them from activating the Duo Drive later on in the turn, which is really good. But I think the problem with Droll is it's not exactly the best into what I feel like are the other two decks that in the top three. So I think those decks are Maliss and Fiendsmith variants, and Droll just doesn't do that much against them. So unfortunately, I feel like Droll isn't good enough to be main decked for sure, but I definitely think it has the potential to be main decked. It's generally a card that's able to single-handedly stop some decks sometimes, and I feel like in a hand trap format where it's so important to get the most out of your hand traps, Droll might be one of the best ones to help you accomplish that. But that being said, I don't think it's a standout main deck staple, and I definitely think there's some consideration to see how the format goes, but at least at the moment, I feel like you could consider playing it because it's so good against ryzeal. Next up is Dominus Impulse, and I feel like it's almost criminal to say this, but I actually don't think Impulse is that great in this upcoming format. If we once again consider that ryzeal is probably going to be the best deck, Impulse just isn't that good against them. Like, all their guys are inherent summons, and there isn't really a good card you can stop with Impulse consistently. Like, it's still pretty solid into every other deck out there. It's really good against the Fiendsmith variants. It's probably pretty good against Maliss. But I feel like if it's a card that doesn't do that well against the best and most represented deck of the format, I feel like it's something that you would only really consider putting in the side maybe as like a generic hand trap that can hit pretty much every matchup aside from ryzeal. And I know this is going to sound weird because this is such a great card, but I just feel like this format might actually be the first one where this one just isn't that great. But in general, I feel like if your deck can play this, you may want to consider siding it as it's really good into certain matchups, but it just isn't good enough to be mained in my opinion. Dominus Purge, on the other hand, I think is pretty solid as a main deck potential. Obviously, not every deck's going to be able to play it like Dominus Impulse, but I feel like for the decks that can play it, it's a pretty solid card. This is a card that is pretty much never going to be able to be negated, so your opponent can't call by it, and your opponent most likely is not going to be able to cross out it because not every deck's going to be playing it. So I feel like this is a hand trap that'll resolve quite often, and of course, being a trap card helps you play around a card like Triple Tactics, Talents, and Thrust, which is super nice. So I feel like Dominus Purge is a pretty solid card. I'd probably choose to main deck it if your deck plays one of those three attributes. Next up is Dogwood, and I think Dogwood is the definition of a side deck card. Like, there's no way you'd be main decking this card. I don't know if it's necessary. I mean, not every deck has a time win condition, but not every deck needs one as well. So I don't feel like there's any more to say about this card. If your deck struggles in time, maybe it's something you could consider, but otherwise, I don't think it's a very good card. Next up is Fuelos, and I think that Fuelos is still a really solid card this format. I probably put it in main deck staple. It's really good into Malice and the Fiendsmith decks, and against ryzeal, like sure, they can make a half board, but it's not like it's terrible against them either. Chaining it to Ice ryzeal can be pretty solid because you're pretty much guaranteed to get a +1. Even if they don't start with Ice ryzeal, it can cut off cards like the Fiendsmith package if they do choose to play it in their deck because it just won the YCS, and even if they don't, just going 1-for-1 to prevent them from popping off with a card like Duo Drive may be worth it. So I feel like Fuelos is pretty solidly a main deck staple in most decks. It's a really good card, and I feel like it's not really going anywhere this format. Next up is Purulia, and I would say Purulia is pretty much the definition of a side deck staple. This is still a very good card into most of the meta decks, and especially against ryzeal considering all their guys summon from hand. But I don't think there's a world where you can main this because it does feel like it is a smidge below Fuelos, because there are going to be times where decks can simply just play around Purulia by giving you like 1 or 2 draws and then still full comboing, whereas with Fuelos, that's pretty hard for the top 3 decks right now. So while Purulia is definitely not a bad card, I'd say you probably choose to main Fuelos before maining Purulia. Next up is Impermanence. Impermanence is pretty definitively a main deck staple in my opinion. As a hand trap, same idea as Dominus Purge and Impulse, doesn't play into Talents, doesn't play into Thrust as well, and of course going second has applications as well into an already established board. Definitely a solid main deck staple, and I definitely run it alongside with Ashe. Next up is Phantasme, and I think that Phantasme is probably one with side deck potential. I mean, this card seems like it's pretty solid into a deck like Malice, which spams a bunch of Link monsters, and it should be fairly decent into Fiendsmith as well, but I don't really know if it's worth playing because I feel like the way you want to approach hand traps this format is to flat out stop your opponent for the most part. You'd rather have this be a hand trap that actually stops your opponent. But that's not to say Phantasme is a bad card. I feel like if there's a format that Phantasme can be good in, this is probably the format where it's had the most potential in my opinion, and I definitely wouldn't sleep on this card. Next up is Contact C. I don't really know if Contact C is that great against the top 3 decks. Like, you could argue against ryzeal, if you catch your opponent off guard when they lock themselves into rank 4, Contact C can be really good. But if the ryzeal decks are just playing the Fiendsmith package, then you just get heavily punished for playing this card in the first place because you just gave them a free body. And I feel like a lot of ryzeal players are going to start trying out the Fiendsmith variant and move away from the pure variant, making Contact C a lot worse. Against Malice, I don't think it's that great either. I think the Malice monsters, for the most part, at least should be able to use generic monsters as long as there's a Malice card present. So I think Contact C is pretty bad against them. It's also really bad against Fiendsmith. So the more I talk about it, the more I feel like this card just isn't going to be that good this format. There are just too many Fiendsmith decks running around, and it just doesn't do enough to even the decks outside of the top 3, so I don't feel like this is the format for Contact C. Next up is Retaliating C, and I also feel like it's not really the format for Retaliating C either. There aren't going to be too many spell cards that have the effect to summon, especially because the main one, being Hallowed Azamina, is now probably going to be played a lot less, as less and less decks choose to play the Diabellstar engine since there's no more OSS. So I feel like there isn't anything really crazy to hit with Retaliating C. Doesn't really do anything to any of the top 3 decks, so not really worth it in my opinion. Next up is Mourner. I think that Mourner is probably just going to be your like 7th, 8th, and 9th copy of Veiler and Impermanence. Like, you'd always choose to play Impermanent Veiler before Mourner in my opinion. There's some consideration to playing Mourner over Veiler, I suppose, if your deck does choose to play Shifter, but I feel like in general Mourner's just strictly worse than these 2 cards, so I'd probably put it in main deck potential, and that's only if you choose to play a lot more Effect Negator hand traps. Next up is Meister. I think this card sucks. I don't really think this is the format for it either. There aren't too many very high impact grave effects, and also even if there were, I just feel like they're just better and higher impact hand traps out there. Something that's worth considering though, I think, is Nibiru. I feel like Nibiru is actually main deck worthy this format. I really like this card against both ryzeal and Malice. Malice is a little bit more obvious. The deck doesn't really have a great way to play around it, because if they choose to, their end board's just going to be a lot weaker. And you may think against ryzeal, oh, they can just make Duo Drive on summon 4, grab, cross, and call it a day. But I feel like if they're summoning a raw Duo Drive with no like protection XYZ, so like no Rafflesia or no copy of the Photon XYZ, then Nibiru just hard punishes them. I feel like ryzeal players will choose to respect Imperm and Veiler and Ogre a little bit more than they respect Nibiru, just because there's more copies of those out there. Meaning, I feel like if they're able to set up the Photon XYZ, then they're going to play harder into Nibiru, because now they're going to summon Duo Drive past their 5th summon. So I feel like for that reason, Nibiru can be pretty solid. It's okay into the rest of the meta as well. The decks that I showed in the strong meta potential, A few of them get hit a little bit by Nibiru, but I just feel like it has enough impact against the top decks that it's probably going to be worth playing in your deck. There is one thing I will say though, it isn't great against the Fiendspit decks. Like, they can either force it out early by threatening a Caesar, or they can just simply pass turn and do it all again on the next turn. So that is something to consider, but I personally feel like Nibiru is a card that has quite a lot of potential and can be played in the main this format. Next up is Shifter, and I think Shifter is probably just going to be a side deck staple, and that sounds crazy, but if you consider what 2 of the top 3 decks are, being ryzeal and Maliss, I feel like if these are the most popular decks, then it just isn't going to be impactful enough a lot of the times. It's not like it does absolutely nothing to those decks, but I feel like those decks are able to play well enough under it that it just isn't really worth playing, in my opinion. It's going to be a similar case as when Kashtira was tier 1, where Kashtira players would simply just side it because in the mirror match it was bad. This is a similar format where it's going to be great against everything else, but against Maliss and ryzeal, it just isn't worth putting in your main deck, in my opinion. And I just rather side it for those matchups that it'll be a lot more impactful in. Next up is Chaos Hunter and Lancia, and I think these fall in a similar boat. Lancia obviously is going to be a little bit better because it takes a little bit less setup, but something to consider with Chaos Hunter is that some decks can bring it out with a card like Mannequin Cat, because then that means against the decks that will shifter you, you now have a searchable way to counter it, and if your deck can somehow cheat this out, then now you have a searchable way to lock out Maliss. So I feel like Chaos Hunter is probably potential for side deck depending on your deck, and Lancia is pretty definitively a side deck staple. It's great against Maliss, doesn't really do too much against anything else aside from Ritual Beast, but the fact that it hits Maliss so hard is probably already good enough in my opinion to side deck, and I feel like that you should be giving that deck quite a bit of respect. Next up is Valor. I'd say Valor is probably the top of main deck potential. I don't want to say it's a main deck staple because I feel like you don't necessarily have to play Valor due to the fact that it is somewhat susceptible to a card like Shifter. There could be players who still choose to play in their deck, and of course Valor isn't a super high impact hand trap all the time. It has the potential to be put in your main deck, but if you do choose to play a deck with a bunch of hand traps, then Valor is probably one of the first ones you consider after considering all the main deck staples. Similar argument with Ghost Ogre. Ghost Ogre seems like it should be pretty solid, but I feel like there are quite a few decks that have good ways to play around it. For example, it doesn't really affect the Fiendsmith deck, and against Maliss, there's a few times you can ogre them and it'll be okay, but it never really should flat out stop their turn. It could potentially stop a ryzeal duo drive, which is I think the biggest appeal of it, and the fact that going second it can be used to stop cards like IP Masquerena as well could be cool, but it is just a step down from the hand traps in the main deck staple tier. That being said though, not a bad card at all. Next up is Vados. I don't think Vados is very good. There aren't that many super crazy field spells this format aside from maybe like Maliss and Underground. The other decks that play field spells either don't really need it, or popping their field spell just isn't going to do enough to stop them, so I don't feel like this is the format for Vados. Next up is Ghostbell. So talking about Ghostbell in the context of Maliss first, this card is able to do quite a lot onto their end board, surprisingly. Typical Maliss end board you might expect is Terahertz with a Reborn trap to reborn the White Binder, which will banish 3 cards, and then they'll start popping off with a bunch of their banish effects. But if you just spell the trap card that reborns, then it actually shuts off quite a bit of their end board and their layered disruption. All their disruption would essentially then be concentrated on the Firewall Dragon Terahertz, as well as any hand traps they could potentially have. So I feel like Ghostbell as a card could be decent in that matchup. Not to mention it acts like an extra Ash Blossom against Maliss and Underground because it does have the potential to banish from Graveyard, which can be nice. So I feel like against the Maliss matchup, it's not a terrible card. Against the ryzeal matchup on the other hand, it's probably very mid, because by the time you're able to use it, it's going to be on the node ryzeal or on the ryzeal plugin, and by then they should already be playing the game, so I don't really feel like this card is very good unless it's like your second or third hand trap in your hand. So I'd probably rule it out there. Against the Fiendsmith decks, it does have some potential to do some things to the Fiendsmith engine, but I just don't feel like it's good enough overall to be played in the main deck or even consider putting in the main deck. But that being said though, maybe it's a card you could consider siding because it does have very specific applications against certain matchups, and I feel like it does have the potential to be good in those matchups. It just isn't good enough in enough matchups in my opinion. Next up is DD Crow. I don't think DD Crow is very good this format. There isn't really anything to hit out of the graveyard aside from the Fiendsmith stuff, and I feel like they're just better cards you'd rather play, like the Bystials. So I'm gonna put the Bystials in side deck potential. It is good against the Fiendsmith decks, but other than that, doesn't do anything to Maliss, doesn't do anything to ryzeal, and there are only a few decks outside of those where it's particularly good against. So I feel like these are cards that you would just choose to side deck in my opinion, and But if you do want cards that remove stuff from the graveyard, then this is probably a step up for DD Crow. And then finally, we have the Psi frames. Gamma and Delta, I think, are side deck potentials. These cards can still be pretty good. Gamma, of course, is a super high impact hand trap, and if you choose to play Gamma, you're probably going to choose to play Delta as well. So I feel like the conversation should more be, is it worth playing Delta? Because if you choose to play Delta, you may as well slot the Gamma in there anyways, since you're already playing the driver. With a card like Delta, there are a few decent spells in this format you can go after. I feel like Delta, though, isn't super great this format. I feel like the top decks don't really have like a spell they have to resolve in order to win the game. It just isn't going to be high impact enough a lot of the time, in my opinion, since a lot of the top decks use monsters as their extenders as opposed to spells. Unless you're playing Brenned every single round, then I don't think Delta is going to be that good. So I feel like this is probably just going to be relegated to the bottom of side deck potential. Maybe if people start playing more cards like Crossout Designator in the main deck, it could be worth it to force your other hand traps through. But I feel like that really depends on how the format goes overall. If the format does head in that direction, it could be pretty good, because it is pretty much one of the only cards that's able to stop Crossout and force your other hand traps through. But outside of that application, I feel like it just doesn't do enough, in my opinion. Finally, Epsilon. I don't think this card is very good. There shouldn't be any trap cards your opponents should be shotgunning in this format, because all the ones that people are playing are like Dimensional Barrier or Simo Archfiends, which are just lingering anyways, and your opponent will just always wait for you to commit cards to the board before using it. So Epsilon, not that good. But those are just some of my thoughts. Let me know what you thought about this format in the comment section below. What do you think will be the best decks? What do you think will be the best hand traps? Let me know if you think I missed anything as well. And before I sign off, I just want to ask you guys to please check if you're subscribed to the channel. I'm trying to hit 10,000 by the end of 2024, and it would mean a lot if you could just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. If this video has taught you something and you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing and leaving a comment, because it really does help the channel out. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.